Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now what I've got whizzing around in front of me today is a soldier of the 158th Siege Regiment, and it is a request that's come up a couple of times since the announcement of the new Astra Militarum Codex, although it's always going to be the Imperial Guard Codex in my head. Now this fella, he is painted using quite a few Army Painter paints, and that's for a couple of reasons. First off, I've really enjoyed using them. And secondly, if you are going to be putting together an Imperial Horde army with a whole bunch of plastic miniatures, chances are good anywhere that you can save a few pennies is a good idea. So I will link in the description to some of the other Krieg painting guides that I've done. A lot of those do concentrate more on Citadel paints, but you can chop and choose as you like. It's a nice and simple method, so all of the paints will be listed in the description below. Same as always, let's get started. So right up top, some of you are going to notice that the helmet and the gas mask are not the plastic version, and that's true. This is actually a 3D print. It comes from Tiny Legends, and I will make sure there's a link to them in the description. You can also get these as physical parts, so if you're like me and you're not a huge fan of the modern plastic Krieg gas masks, you do have some options for your infantry, and I'm sure they'll eventually update those for the riders and what have you as well. But once you've got your miniature assembled, whether you've added any third-party bits or not, first thing to do is to prime them. And here I've used Death Guard Green. It's going to be the predominant color on the miniature, so it's kind of a no-brainer. Now if you do end up with any bits where you haven't quite reached it with the primer spray, rather than standing outside and just, filling all of the detail by spraying it 3 or 4 times, just let that dry, bring it on in, and add a little bit of Death Guard Green from the pot. I haven't here. I was quite lucky, it all came together quite well, but any bits where you're concerned about coverage, a little bit of thinned down paint from the pot is going to be much better than, like I said, filling in all the detail with your primer. Now the first thing that we're going to do is to add some texture to his uniform, and this, to my mind, is kind of the key to these speed painting methods. What I've got is a little bit of Nurgling Green and a raggedy old dry brush here. You'll see I've worked most of that off into a bit of kitchen towel. I'm going to dry brush the edge of his base to see what I'll leave behind, and I might have taken a little bit much off my brush there. What I can do to start off with is actually dry brush along areas I know I'm going to paint later, and looking at his rifle there, yeah sure, let's start going over his jacket. I haven't got too much there. So I'm going to go quite heavily over the jacket, because what I want to do is accentuate all of the curves and folds in this by adding a bit of texture. Now this is going to help the coat stand out from things like his rifle and his helmet, despite being a fairly similar color. Now I've given that a couple of passes, and you'll see the idea is that most of the jacket is actually that Nurgling Green, with just a little bit of the Death Guard Green remaining in the recesses. What I'm going to do now is the same thing again with Underhive Ash, except I want to concentrate more on the edges, the extreme creases and folds. The reason why I'm using this is that it's got a slight yellowy tint to it, which actually works super well over a green to accentuate those high points. Now it is possible that you can skip straight to the Underhive Ash. You don't need the Nurgling Green, but I think it does add a little bit more to the transition there. What I'm going to do now is bring down that green a little bit, and I'm going to use here, this is Voodoo shade from the Army Painter. Now this one's coming along soon with the John Blanche paint sets, and there are going to be individual bottles sold as well, so don't worry if you don't want to pick up the whole set, though my goodness they are rather nice. Now this is quite similar to Mortarion Grime, but the Voodoo shade, it has a little bit more, it's got a bit more guts to it really. You'll see it, I think, more clearly. All the same, if you want to, that Mortarion Grime will do the job relatively well. Just make sure you're going over all of the fabric. When that's dried, you'll see we have a vibrant, more rich green, but it isn't really all that much darker, which we're going to do later on. I quite like doing it that way. You can skip that step if you fancy, but you're just going to get a slightly less vibrant green. What I have now is Uniform Grey from the Army Painter. This is quite close to Dawnstone, if you want to stick to Citadel paints, but I think you'll see the coverage on this is pretty bleeding good. So I'm going to go over his trousers with this. If you wanted a darker finish, I would probably go to Mechanicus Standard Grey, but bearing in mind, because we are going to shade this, I don't want to have to highlight it if I can avoid it. Starting from a slightly lighter tone, I'll make that a bit quicker. Now for most of his leather equipment, what I'm going to use is Mournfang Brown. There isn't really a direct equivalent to this in the Army Painter range. It's a little bit more saturated than Leather Brown is. Before we start getting to some of the other soft details, what we're going to do is paint in some black bits. Now for this I'm actually using Ironclad Grey. This is quite close to Corvus Black. You'll see if we fill in the eye sockets now, we're not going to go ahead, base coat the mask and then struggle to paint the eyes later. I'm also going to use this to paint in the weapon itself. You can use a straight black for this, but I like using a very dark grey because when we shade it, it's still going to have a little bit of visual interest to it. Some variation in the colour. As well as those black bits, you might notice I have actually changed the colour of the leather stuff. I should have used XV88 originally. I just picked the wrong colour and I was running with it. I'll make sure that the description and what you see on screen reflect earlier on what you ought to be using. Don't use Mournfang Brown. Whoops. This is Leather Brown from the Army Painter. This is a little bit lighter than Steel Legion Drab, which would be the Citadel equivalent for what I'm going to do here. And again, a slightly lighter color to start with is going to help us when it comes to shading this. As well as his boots, I'm going to quickly just blast up the leg wraps on this as well. It'll make it a little bit easier for when we paint over the top of those. Now we're going to move on here to Dusty Skull, and I'm going to paint 3 details using this color. First of all, his leg wraps, and those will be nice and quick. I'm also going to paint in his mask using this, so taking my time. I'm going to come up close to the uniform jacket, because I don't want to hit that if I can avoid it. And as well, the blanket on the back of his pack. Now again, you can use something like Rakarth Flesh for this. It's quite a similar color. It's a little more saturated, a bit more meaty, which, with a name like Flesh, you could probably expect. Now the helmet and the little gas mask canister here on the back of his pack, these are normally shown as being almost identical to the jacket. Because we are going to shade them though, what I'm going to do is use here Camouflage Green from the Army Painter. This is quite close to Lauren Forest, maybe a little bit lighter. It's going to give us just a slightly different finish to the jacket, because we spent so much time making the coat look, textured and a little bit lived in. So I'm picking a similar color here, but by making sure I have a nice solid finish, it's going to look more like hard plate and metal than the rest of his gear. Now the gloves on the 158, they're usually shown as being quite a dark brown. So I have here Bootstrap Brown. This is basically Dryad bark, but it's the Army Painter equivalent. A quite common question folks will ask me, if I'm using this color, what's the Citadel, what's the Vallejo, what's the nearest equivalent? And the short answer is, you got to eyeball it. Not every paint range has a direct analog to their competitors' colors, which a lot of the time is the reason why you'll see me using 3 or 4 different manufacturers on a miniature, because you pick the right tool for the job. But close enough is honestly close enough. Now we're down to the last handful of details. Most of these are going to be metallic. So what I have is plate mail metal from the Army Painter. I'm going to go over the gun with this, or at least the bits I want to be metallic. And also don't forget the bayonet hanging from his belt on the other side, if he doesn't have it attached to his gun. Now with shoulder pads, you could go ahead and paint them in with Ironclad Grey at the same time as you do everything else that's going to be black. But instead I'm going to use Iron Warriors, which is a nice dark gunmetal color. When we shade it, it's going to look almost black, just a little bit more interesting than straight black would be. I like the metallic finish to these pads. As well, I'm also going to use it to paint in a little sigil on his helmet. Then finally, there are a few brass details, and for this I like to use Retributor armor. It's a little bit bright, it is a gold color essentially, but again, once it's shaded, it's going to look a lot more reasonable. Once you're satisfied with your base coats, it's time to go ahead and shade them. Now I'm going to shade the entire miniature, which includes the jacket we have already shaded. And for this, I'm going to use Sonic Tonic, or Marine Juice, whatever it is you want to call it. Some people get quite funny about calling it Marine Juice. The recipe for this I'm going to put in the bottom of the description. The long story short is that this is an almost universal wash. Similar to Agrak's Earthshade, but a touch warmer, and with the added medium that you'll get in here, it flows a little bit more easily where you need it. So we're going to pop this straight over the top of everything. Don't let it pull too heavily, but once you've got it all over the entire model, we'll go ahead and leave them for about half an hour to see what we get. Make sure that you are really working it into any nooks and crannies and recesses. Now we've got loads of definition and shading. The green on his jacket is nice and deep, and yeah, he's looking pretty cool. One thing I am going to do, and make sure that you've left him to dry thoroughly before you do this, is get a little bit of dark tone straight from the pot, and I'm going to pop this over the black shoulder pads. Now you may want to instead use Nuln Oil. It's totally up to you. Now you might choose to let those shoulder pads dry before moving on, but if you're careful, you can paint in these next details while they're still wet. So I'm going to be a little mindful here as I grab some skeleton bone, and I'm going to paint straight down the center of the mask with a wee bit of this, and just a couple of little bits to accentuate the high points in the creases here. I want to try and be fairly sparing with this, because otherwise it's going to turn the mask almost white, and you don't really want that. Now, I have mentioned in a couple of videos that a really easy way to get a cheap and effective highlight for pretty much any color is to mix in a little bit of ivory. So if you want to save yourself a paint here, what you could do would be to mix some ivory into XV88, but instead what I've got here is Balor Brown. And using the edge of my brush, I'm just going to get a little bit of this to catch, that might be a bit much, the very edges of the leather here. Now, anywhere that I put too much on, what I can do is go back with some XV88 and just tidy that up. Now, I've got the Army Painter's Necrotic Flesh here, and I'm going to do just a little bit along the edges of the helmet. If you do have the Nurgling Green in layer form from Citadel, you could use that instead quite happily. Now going back to some plate mail metal, we're going to do little scratches along the black bits on the gun. So you want to make sure you've got very little on your brush while you do this. And instead of painting single straight lines, just dab lightly where you want it to look as though the metallic bits have quite a bit of impact, be knocked around some. It takes a bit of practice to get the feel for this, because you don't want these to necessarily join up. But a good uneven dinging with some metal work is a really easy way to highlight a whole bunch of metal stuff without needing a bunch of different colors. Another couple of handy spots to pop that are going to be along the edges of the black metal and on the helmet itself, that little knobbin there on the front. Just a wee bit of silver there will help a lot. What I'm going to do now is to varnish them, and I'll pop his base on them. Both of those will be listed in the description, so if you want to follow along, you can copy that, or base him to match the rest of your army. Let's get a look at what he looks like once he is all finished. And so, there at last, our soldier of the 158th Siege Regiment is complete. Now obviously there's a load more that you could do if you wanted to. We haven't highlighted his trousers or his boots or anything, but there is a law of diminishing returns when you're going to be putting together a horde army. So pick your battles, go for the things that are going to be the most impressive at table distance, and forget about the rest. A quick note to point out is that if you do want to apply the decals, I would go ahead and do those before applying the varnish. I've varnished them here as a final step, but decals first and then seal them under the varnish. Life will be good. So, as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of my wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my gorgeous producers who are showing up on screen now. Thank you so much for your support, folks. I say it every time, really mean it. Now, any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Blue Sky and Instagram are both linked there too. So, thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.